and welcome to What the Fringe, the podcast dedicated to all things Fringe theater. I'm your host, Lauren Hance. Each week I visit with a Fringe artist to hear all about their endeavors and gain insight into their process. This week I'm visiting with Joanne Hartstone of Joanne Hartstone Presents. Joanne is a key figure in the Adelaide, Australia art scene, continuing to push the boundaries of theater through innovative programming and international collaboration. Joanne's first foray into the Fringe scene was in 2006 with her solo show, Fitting Rooms. Over the next few years, she found herself shifting into independent producing and working in theaters from Adelaide to Edinburgh. And in 2014, Joanne began producing and presenting shows under her own banner while also touring her own solo shows globally. In 2020, as a response to the COVID pandemic, Joanne created a digital platform for streaming live theater called Black Box Live, which streamed 52 performances over 5 weeks and was watched in 37 different countries. This year, Joanne Hartstone Presents will be presenting 14 shows across, that's right, 14, let me just say that again, 14 shows across 6 venues at the Adelaide Fringe.
The work that I present always has to have a quality to it that I know that audiences will resonate with. I also need to enjoy working with the artists because we're not getting paid a huge amount of money. If suddenly it's really hard to communicate or there's friction, or this rarely happens because I dare I say I've chosen some amazing artists to work with, and they're, great friends now as well as colleagues. So I also make sure that the process is going to be enjoyable working with them for a very intense period of time. And that's why I tend to work with artists over and over.
Joanne Hartstone is a South Australian theatre maker, actor and performer, playwright, director, producer, and presenter, specializing in international theatrical collaborations, live theatre and cabaret, and immersive site-specific events. Joanne has created and curated pop-up venues in the Adelaide Botanic Gardens and the Queen's Theatre in Adelaide, and presented multiple seasons as a performer and producer in Edinburgh, Hollywood, London, New York, and Sydney. Joanne has been presenting work in the Adelaide Fringe since 2006. She won the inaugural Made in Adelaide Award, the Frank Ford Award, Holden Street Theatres Award, multiple Best Theatre, Best Event, and Critics Circles Award, and 2 Innovation Awards for her theater streaming platform, Black Box Live. Joanne is also a mentor to emerging artists, performers, and playwrights. Joanne, welcome to What the Fringe.
I'm so excited to chat with you. This is really great. This is an international Fringe chat. How exciting.
I know, so fun, right? So I found you, we didn't know each other previously. A lot of times I have guests on that I've met at Fringe, but I was listening to Fringe Pod, which is Adelaide's podcast about the festival, and it was their first episode, and I heard you with a few other ladies. You guys, I was like blown away. I was like, these women are amazing. And I was like, Joanne, I got to get her on the podcast. And by some stroke of luck, I reached out and you said, sure. And here you are.
And here I am.
Okay, so you studied theater, and then
I did, yeah.
What led you to Fringe versus kind of a traditional theater route?
I mean, in South Australia, the Fringe is sort of the traditional theatre route. It wasn't until I did it. Or my generation kind of did it, So I graduated from Flinders Drama Centre, which is like a performing arts degree, an honours degree. And then, you wait for the phone to ring and you get cast in a show. Well, I wasn't really happy to do that. I didn't want to wait for the phone to ring. So I got involved straight away in Fringe because Fringe is something that has happened my entire life. It's been running for 65 years or something, Adelaide Fringe. It's a really long-running Fringe. And so it's always kind of been there. And, of course, we have top-tier professional level theatre, but the chances of getting into that straight out of drama school is pretty slim. So I sort of went straight into Fringe, and I did a show called Fitting Rooms. And then again in 2008, I jumped in with a show that I directed called Long Gone Lonesome Cowgirls. And I also wrote and performed in a cabaret with a couple of my other friends as well. So sort of from the beginning, I didn't really do just one thing. I always kind of did a variety of things. I directed something, I wrote something, I performed in something. And that's kind of been then happening for the rest of the 19 years that I've been doing Adelaide Fringe. I don't just do one thing anymore.
Oh,
So that's how I got into Fringe, really. It's because it's always been there and it was the best opportunity for me to get to work.
yeah, Fringe is great for someone like yourself or someone like me that kind of likes a lot of the different aspects of theater, of like producing and writing and performing and just everything, because you have to do everything as a Fringe artist. Now, I'm very curious of this, since that you said your generation kind of paved the way for a lot of people to go towards Fringe, because like Fringe is not as big in the US. And so people know about it, but it's not like it is there. So so tell me about that, like how people are now kind of coming out of drama school and going into Fringe. Like how did that shift kind of happen?
I think it's, it's partly to do with the opportunity for work after graduating. There just isn't really the opportunity to have a solid career in South Australia in the performing arts without diving into Fringe in some level. And I do want to acknowledge that for some artists, they're not makers, they're performers. They're there to be hired, to be brought along with somebody else's story. Or you have directors who aren't playwrights, so there's a whole ecosystem of artists who emerge from drama school and are looking for something to do. And so there are, in the broad church that is Fringe, there are roles. They're not necessarily paid hugely well, but as we know, it's really important once you graduate to get experience, and as much experience as you possibly can, because you're still actually nurturing your emerging artist within. So when I graduated, it was just as this shift away from, you'll get a call from State Theatre Company and you'll be in a show within 6 months to a year or something, and then you'll then kind of go on and do that. And that did happen for maybe one person I graduated from. Actually, he went straight into films. That's right, he went straight into films. And the rest of us were kind of like, okay, what's going to happen now, And interestingly, now I've had chats with Chris Hurrell, who runs Flinders Drama Centre now. He wasn't there when I was there. And they're actually now incorporating Fringe as part of the curriculum. So you do a show in fourth year within the Fringe, learn about the Fringe environment as part of your learning, which I think is fantastic. They're kind of embracing that this is the pathway now for people. So yeah, it's a change.
That is so exciting, and really exciting to hear university embracing Fringe, because again, it is, I feel like, so much the epitome of theater. You learn so much. I love how you said nurturing that artist. It's a really great space to do that, and it's just really special. So that very much excites me that that's happening at university there in Australia.
Well, it's also preparing artists and makers for the real world, and the real world these days is a sort of a fringe festival kind of trajectory. I think it's very sensible, but it also teaches people about commerciality. And not all of these discussions can be about the art. It also has to be about the finances and the business and the marketing and, and all of those really important logistics that come alongside doing a show. So that's the other thing I think is really exciting, to expose emerging artists to as early as possible so they can learn in a way in which they can be caught as well should they come up with challenges.
Absolutely. I say all the time, nobody in drama school gave me a marketing course. Like, I knew nothing about that when I jumped into Fringe. And I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I still kind of feel like that. And I take advice from every person that I can get advice from, because I'm just trying to learn. And I've known a lot of people like from my drama school that have gone on to like arts administration and those types of things, which get into that. But you still have to learn that skill. But Fringe drops you in the deep end. and they're like,
Yeah, exactly
go,
right.
little duck, swim, right?
Yeah, exactly. I never saw a spreadsheet until I was having to make one myself. And maths and the arts, well, apparently they're one and the same.
Right?
Yeah.
It definitely takes like a certain person to do kind of that production, like what you're doing as a producer. That is a different skill set than, say, kind of like your traditional actor, or just like you said, there's some people that are just actors or just directors or just designers. And so it's fun to like see if like, oh, is that my skill set? While they're in university and they're like, oh, this might be the place I fit.
Well, interestingly, when I was in fourth year at Flinders Drama Centre, I did a show. I did Hamlet. I played Gertrude. And we were directed by a visiting lecturer, John Green, who was actually an American. He was absolutely amazing and was directing us in all these sorts of physical theatre ways, doing a Shakespeare. And he actually told my university professor, who has since told me, Joanne's a good performer, but she's going to be an even better production manager. And maybe it's just because I was telling everyone what to do and organising costumes and set and like that sort of thing. But that sort of was like, even back then they were noticing that it wasn't just my skill on stage that I was utilising and nurturing. It was all of the back of house stuff, front of house stuff, It's funny that some people just have it in them.
They do. Well, and a lot of people go into theater school, and tell me if this is like that in Australia, where, I mean, especially in my program, it was a smaller kind of liberal arts college, and we got to do a lot of different things, and most of us came in as actors, and most of us left as something different. Like my degree ended up being in directing, and I didn't find that until I took a directing class, and I was like, what's this? This is super cool, Is that kind of the same there in Australia, the journey?
Not as much, I think, but I think once you leave, then you diversify because you have to, So I think mostly they leave, they graduate being excellent performers and having made some original work as well. So theatre makers, I would say, or filmmakers. But I do think then it's afterwards. So if I think about just the people in my year, I've got very few actually are still in the performing arts or in performing arts adjacent. Some work for a charity, some do some film work. My best friend Jess, who I went to school with, she's an amazing pop artist now. So she's a musician. Still a performer, of course, but she's very much more heavily into music while I'm into theatre. So, I think that diversification comes from the exposure to the industry, which, let's face it, in a university setting, in a training scenario, it's protected. You're bubbled in a way.
Yeah.
And it's really not until you go out and work out where your chops are that you also work out what your pathway is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well stated. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your performing career, because you have done quite a bit. Talk to me about the difference, because there was a bit of a gap between Fitting Rooms and some of your more current shows, which was The Girl Who Jumped Off the Hollywood Sign and That Daring Australian Girl. How do those compare and contrast as far as like your baby first show to these, more experienced performer?
Fitting Rooms, I was the hired actor.
Okay.
So that's Jennifer Lusk's play. And so I would say that was just one of the shows that I was hired to do. And I've had a few of those, like I was in Misery, where I was hired. I ended up producing that for a few other seasons because that's what I do. The Storm, I was just a performer in that. So I've done a fair bit just as a performer. But it actually took me quite a long time to write my first solo show. And that was The Girl Who Jumped Off the Hollywood Sign. And I think the way that kind of happened was I was helping all of these other people over many years produce their work and present their work. And I was running venues and I was curating solo shows and I was seeing it all happen. And then I just had this epitome of, why am I not doing this for myself? I have these stories in my head that like I can see it. I know that I can create. And I'd written other plays before and worked with young people and mentored them and that's the thing. So I knew I was a playwright, but a solo show is obviously a different beast. So I remember that I was just like, I just need a boost. I just need to push myself in and do it. So I registered the title in Adelaide Fringe with a fairly loose copy And then I started writing.
Yep.
Danger. I would not recommend that to many people, but for me, I actually already knew the story in my head before I had started like putting words on the page. And The Girl Who Jumped Off the Hollywood Sign is about a fictitious character, Evie Edwards, who is searching for fame and her chance in the Hollywood star system in the golden age of Hollywood. The story evolves. She's up on the H of the Hollywood sign and she's contemplating what to do next. And she goes through kind of the journey that led her up to that very moment and how she'd been striving towards getting her big break and, you know, looking at the stories of the women, particularly the starlets, that she was really inspired by or had seen kind of going through, like Jean Harlow and Theda Bara and Judy Garland, and kind of like reflecting on their pursuit of fame as well and the cost of it.
Yeah.
But really, it's about an actress who wants to be seen. Well, gee, I wonder where that story came from, you know? So even though it wasn't about me, of course it came from somewhere. So I started writing and I wrote it really quickly. I registered it in October and I had my first draft ready by December, and I started rehearsals in my living room in January and performed in March. So suddenly
Beautiful.
I'm a solo performer. And I didn't exactly expect the reaction. I knew it would be good, you know, because like I know where my bar is, you know, I know the kind of the quality of work that I want to create. So I knew it would be good. But the reaction I got from it, you know, I won the Made in Adelaide Award, I won the Holden Street Awards, I got all of these like amazing reviews. And then I went straight over to Hollywood. And then I was booked in for Edinburgh as well. And like my Edinburgh season sold out. And then I was picked up again to go to New York, and it just kind of like exploded. So I was like, oh, right, this is what happens. Okay, welcome to my bigger career.
That's really exciting. And I mean, you've put a lot of work in as a producer, like you said, so you know what works, you know what's good.
Yeah.
And even the creative process, those stories were ruminating for a long time. So it doesn't surprise me that it took you a short period of time to write it, because you've been writing it for years.
Exactly right. Yeah. My second solo show, That Daring Australian Girl, I'd actually been researching the show for about 5 years and wrote different iterations of the show. Like I wrote a 4-hander and a 2-hander, and I was like, no, it's just still not right. And then I realized, oh, it's a solo show. So I put all of those 5 years of research and work into the show. And again, I wrote that while I was in New York, actually doing Girl Who Jumped Off the Hollywood Sign. And I wrote the bulk of that show in about 3 weeks and just churned it out and then put it up in Adelaide Fringe in March. So from January to March.
Wow.
So it was very, very quick.
Yeah, but again, you've been writing it for 5 years. So
but I've been writing it for 5 years. Yeah,
that's the journey of scripts. So that makes sense. Well, that's really beautiful. Thanks for sharing all of that with us. So let's shift to producing. Other than Sir John Green, American guy, telling you that you're a producer, kind of putting that bug in your ear, what drew you to producing, and when did you start to realize this is my thing? I really love it. This is what I want to do.
It happened by accident because in Fringe you have to produce your shows. And I realized very quickly that I was good at it. I have a good attention to detail, and my mother says I'm quite good at following things through to the end. And producing is very stressful. So part of being a producer is managing that stress. And that's just something I've learned how to do. But I also, as I was kind of producing, so I was producing in Fringe, and then I went over to London and I worked with Guy Masterson with his company Theatre Tours International, and I general managed and learnt the ropes with him to begin with. So I learnt from him his version of producing, and then I kind of was like, oh, okay, well now I can do this for myself. And I produced under my own umbrella in 2014 for the first time, after about 6 or 7 years working with other people and being an associate producer and doing that in the UK and in Australia. It was not really like, oh, this is my jam, I love it. It was more of a means to an end. And it was my way of making things happen, because me being on stage is not the most important thing. It's actually the stories being told is the most important thing. The work being shared is the more important thing. And it's my privilege to be involved in making that happen in whichever way it needs to happen. And it just so happened that I just kept doing it, and I just kept doing it, and I kept doing it. And it actually became a little bit easier the more I was doing it, because I was like, oh, I've already done that. I know how to do that again. Copy, paste, Yep. That spreadsheet will still work for this season. I don't have to make that again. And there is sort of a bit of a list, I guess you can follow, or a sequence to getting a show up on its feet. And so now after 19 Adelaide Fringe seasons, I think I know what I'm doing. I'd like to think so.
I mean, you're presenting 14 shows this year. I think you have a little inkling of what you're doing.
Yeah, it's all right. I mean, but that being said, every show is different, and there are things that you can't expect, and you have to be able to adapt and twist on a dime, and all for the benefit of the show and the audience. So that, I just sort of fell into it and kept going, and then I've still got my playwriting and performing side of things, but I kind of I ran a venue, for example, so that I'd have a venue to put my show on, and then I just opened it up to everybody else as well, so I shared the resources. And producing, it's the same. I do the producing so I can put on the shows that I want people to see, or I want to be in, or that sort of thing. So it's a bit of a means to an end, but it's something that is a very big string to my bow.
Oh, I love it. Well, and I love just your heart for stories and artists that's what is just coming through, is that this is about telling the story, impacting the audience, nurturing the artist. And that's really, really beautiful. And one thing that I love about Fringe, because if any of us are doing it for money, then we need to run the other direction. And so that's when I feel like the art is at its purest and finest, because we're doing it because we love it. And it's so beautiful to see a producer that's like, I'm doing this because I believe in what I'm presenting. And that's really exciting.
I mean, maybe that's why 14 shows is actually a good thing, because I don't get very much financial support from any of them. So if I get a tiny little bit from 14, that's it kind of makes it worth its while. But one thing you said is there's no money in Fringe. There's also no time in Fringe. But if there are your restrictions, if you have no budget and you have no time, and yet you can see some of the amazing stuff that these artists, these human beings come out with in order to solve these solutions, it's astounding. You can go and see a show on Broadway or the West End, or in Sydney, and it's got, it's got $1 million budget. It's got all the bells and whistles, and you're like, yeah, this is great. This is epic. There's definitely a place for that. But then conversely, you see someone who, is performing in a 50-seat theatre. You know that they have 10 minutes to get their show up into the space before the doors are open and the audience comes in.
Yep.
And then they're able to create an entire world in which you have completely left this plane and you're immersed and you're feeling and thinking, and then you get safely planted back in your reality again after an hour. And then they have to turn around in 5 minutes and get out and then go and flyer their show for the next day. I think that is a human feat of wonder. I think both places are amazing, but that's what I really love about Fringe, is that you have to be really inventive. And then when you see the result, sometimes it's amazing.
It's so special, and you're like, I just got to experience that. I'm a handful of people in the world that got to experience this, and the artists are bringing their all, It's really, really cool. Some of the things I love about Fringe. I'm loving this conversation so much. Okay, so talk to me a little bit. Let's talk first a little bit about the differences. So I'm in America, and I do American and Canadian Fringe, which is kind of run on a lottery system, which is you submit your show, you get a number, they draw your number, you're in. And if you don't get your number drawn, you're not in. That's just how it works. The good old American way. And so Adelaide and Edinburgh are run a little bit different. And there's producers like yourself. That is just not really a thing here in America. So talk to me about that system, how that works.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really interesting that we both are working in non-curated festivals, although I would say yours is curated but by accident.
Yes.
Or by random.
Yes.
And ours is actually curated by not the Fringe, but by the venues and the producers, because they then choose which shows they're going to put on. So actually there is a level of curation, even though it's open access. Anyone can apply, but you then need to apply to the venues, and then the venues kind of have their filter that they go through, and not every show gets through. What happens, let's say you apply to a beautiful venue over here, Holden Street Theatres. Let's say you apply to Holden Street, but you don't get programmed. Well, then you go back to the Fringe and you say, right, I'm looking for a venue. My first choice, I wasn't able to get programmed. Where else should I go? And then the Fringe will give you options and have a look at what your show requirements are and try and kind of match you up with the right venue, but then there's no guarantees. We have big hubs over here like Gluttony and the Garden Up and Earthly Delights, and they have something like 160 shows in their enormous spaces, right? But the house of cards that we all build as producers and as venues and artists is that everyone's kind of waiting for these big hubs to kind of announce their shows that they're going to accept. And then everyone who's rejected then kind of goes and scrambles and tries to find another venue. And there's all these kind of, venues are talking to each other, and it's crazy suddenly for a couple of weeks. And then everything kind of goes, and then you find your venue. That's it. You register, boom, and we're locked in, So it's a crazy system, but it seems to work because we all are trying to find the best fit for everybody. And my job as a producer is to actually make that best fit happen. So I go to the venues directly. I have a great relationship with the venues, or if I'm running a venue myself, I know what I'm looking for to curate. And I say, I've got this show. I think it's going to be perfect. This is what it's about. This is why it's good for your demographic, blah, 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 blah. And then I work with the venues directly. So whereas your system is curated, but randomly.
Yes.
Which blows my mind. People miss out, and that's such a shame, because as an artist, you can't just be waiting for a lottery to do the right thing. There's also positives with it as well, right? Because then the Fringe ultimately is supporting the shows. So therefore, if it's your first time and your number gets picked, you're then in this more supportive environment, which will then take you through the number of Fringes or whatever it is. So actually there's a benefit to that, because here, particularly in Edinburgh, the Fringe society is actually very hands-off. It's the venues that are the ones that kind of do what the Fringe in where you're from do. So, but they have a commercial interest in it.
Yes.
Whereas I think Fringe societies are generally, charities, not-for-profit, that sort of thing.
Right.
So, I think that there are benefits to that system where you can be more protected as an artist. And ultimately, the thing that we're not saying is that Fringes exist for you to not do Fringe. Let me explain this, right? You're supposed to bounce out. You're supposed to have your opportunity, perform in the Fringe, and then someone picks you up and takes your show or takes you as an artist and gives you a Netflix series or puts you on a cruise ship or plans a tour around the UK, and then you don't actually need to do Fringe in order to sell your work to an audience. You don't have to self-produce.
Yes.
So that used to be the whole point of Edinburgh and Adelaide, was to do it so that you get put on the West End. And I've seen that happen with a lot of shows. Doesn't happen for most shows, but it does happen. And that's why you kind of invest so much into it, because it's an investment in your artistic career, right? But it's just not happening these days as much as we need it to. Adelaide Fringe has an amazing networking scheme called Honeypot, which is where 300 delegates from around the world all come to Adelaide and they watch shows and they talk to artists and we have conversations with that idea of then planning future tours and giving the show an extra life, right? But I've also been doing Fringe for 19 years. I also have done some bigger stuff, non-Fringe stuff, and there's more things that will happen later this year, which is non-Fringe stuff. But I keep going back to Fringe because actually it's now within the Fringe is so big and it's actually such a commercial entity that you're not really bouncing out of it. You're just kind of staying at like this top end of it, as it were. So it's still got all of this space for emerging artists to come in and try their work and try new works. But then it's also got this kind of very commercial level to it in which you can expect to sell tickets and make some money and, you know, plan the rest of your year around. So that's why people keep doing it.
Let's talk a little bit about you curating your program. How are you scouting shows? How are you bringing them in? And what can people expect from a Joanne Hartstone Presents production? You know, like you as a curator, they're like, I'm going to go see one of her shows. I'm going to expect this kind of show.
Quality is probably the first word that I would say. You can expect quality from the work that I present. Because of my experience and my knowledge of the art form, when I go and see a show, I can't not look at it through my own eyes, you know. So therefore, if I'm enjoying it, if I think it's a good show, that's the first tick. And I can be quite discerning. I can go, okay, yeah, that's cool, that's not for me, or, you know, whatever. I still think there's value in seeing a show that's not for you, though. That's a whole other conversation, but you know, that's why people should take chances on shows, because even if it's bad, you'll still have something to talk about. Yeah. The work that I present always has to have a quality to it that I know that audiences will resonate with. I also need to enjoy working with the artists because we're not getting paid a huge amount of money. If suddenly it's really hard to communicate or there's friction, or this rarely happens because dare I say, I've chosen some amazing artists to work with, and they're, you know, great friends now as well as colleagues. So I also make sure that the process is going to be enjoyable working with them for a very intense period of time. And that's why I tend to work with artists over and over. Wright and Granger, for example, I've worked with them. I first worked with Alex. I first met him in 2012, and here we are in 2025. So you keep working with people that you enjoy working with. And Casey J. Andrews, I presented her first solo show in my theatre in the Adelaide Botanic Garden in 2017. And then every time she's got a new solo show, I'm bringing it back to Australia. And I haven't necessarily seen the work because sometimes it's a world premiere, but I trust in her quality. So someone said to me the other day, it's like knowing the ingredients but not knowing what meal the chef is going to cook. That's very much like that with like Casey or Wright and Granger. Is if they've got a new show, I know it's going to be delicious. Then I also go and see shows. Like I went to Edinburgh a couple of years ago and I saw several of the shows that I'm presenting this year, like Chicken and Nan Me and Barbara Pravi, Helios. And I just sort of went, if you ever want to come to Adelaide, you know how to contact me and I'll help it happen. And yeah, and then just takes 2 years and they'll be on our shores. Then I also try and curate these days looking at something for everybody. So I've got kids shows now that I've started diversifying into. So I've got Mega the Magic Toy Shop at Gluttony, which is for ages like 2 to 6 years old and their families to support them in enjoying a really lovely show. Wright and Granger have got a new family-friendly show called Grandpa Poseidon. And again, I know it's going to be great because it's Wright and Granger, but again, it's opening that up to new audiences. I've got some music shows. I've got a stand-up comedy show for like the first time. But I know the performer, so I was like, all right, yeah, let's give that a go. And then a whole bunch of theatre, some classics like Animal Farm, some new stuff like Help, I Think I'm a Nationalist, which is really controversial. So I'm going to have something in there for everybody to kind of feed their soul, feed their mind and talk, and maybe it has a knock-on effect to human empathy and how we treat each other.
I love that. I was looking through your list, and it felt like there was a lot of heart kind of behind all of those shows. But I feel like most Fringe shows have a heart behind them because it is the artist putting everything about them out there. So,
yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of personal stories that come through in Fringe. And I think there's absolutely a place for that. I tend to not look so much at biodramas, although shows like Now Me and Barbara Pravi is a biodrama. I Am Dram is a biodrama. But that's what Hannah Maxwell, who's the performer of those, she does biodramas. But then, you've got a show like Chicken, where Eva O'Connor
is a chicken. Is a chicken. That's not a biodrama.
That's not a biodrama. And it's one of the best solo shows I've ever seen because she's a chicken who thinks that he's an Irishman who's also a sex addict and a ketamine addict who then becomes an Academy Award-winning actor. Like, it's just, like, the world of Chicken is just huge. Definitely not a biodrama. So, and does that have a lot of heart? Absolutely. But it's not just about us, it's about humanity and all of chicken kind. I love stuff like that. That's what the theatre can do. You can go into a room and spend an hour with a chicken and really believe that you've spent an hour with a chicken who's addicted to sex. You can just,
it's so
it's
cool.
Amazing.
It is.
I love theatre.
I love it too. And my guess is, I don't know if there's a big extensive set. I saw some of the photos, but the costume is like, you put an actor in this gorgeous costume and say, do it. And they do it, and your mind's blown, and you're transported to wherever they are. It's really incredible.
It's also the physicality. What Eva O'Connor does within her physicality, the way she flaps the wings, the way she moves, her bent knees and her head gyrating in a very chicken-like way. I would love to actually see a rehearsal where she's not wearing the costume, because I still think I'd be in the room with a chicken. And that's what I love. I love these performances. I love what artists can do. Again, looking at budgets and turnover times. And, this is not film. This is not main stage musicals. This is something that can get under your skin and into your brain and change the way you look at the world. And that is such a nourishing gift that you can give yourself. So I could wax on about the benefits of theatre. I
know, I love it.
For humanity.
I love it. This is why we do Fringe, and we're all like little kindred spirits halfway around the world. So, well, tell me real quick, what's been one of the biggest challenges that you've faced as a producer, as an artist? You've been doing this a long time. I'm sure you can share about that, what you've learned.
COVID was a really difficult time for a lot of us in the performing arts. And certainly, the industry shut down over here. My tours got cancelled, and suddenly I had an unknown period of time in which I didn't know what I was going to do. I actually went back to my other qualification, and I taught in a high school. I taught history because I was like, well, I'm going to need to eat, that old chestnut. So I taught in a high school, and the teaching that I did with the history then turned into my next solo show, The Reichstag is Burning. So it just kind of goes to show that nothing's wasted, you diversify for a bit and then you come back and you can use it. So I think that period of time, everyone knew that was a very difficult time for the performing arts. Yeah. I was also then able to take that difficulty and innovate, do a pivot. And so I created an online platform called Black Box Live, which looked at live streaming theatre. And now, everyone's like, oh yeah, that's what happened during COVID. Everything kind of went online. But the trouble is I didn't actually like a lot of the online shows that I was watching. I was actually really removed, and I found myself to get quite annoyed by watching it, because when you're in the room and it's there and it's visceral and you can see and hear everything really well and you can choose where you're looking, it's a different experience. But when you've got a phone at the tech desk and the sound isn't that great and the visuals aren't that great and it's just a static camera, I found myself to be quite kind of displaced from the experience, and it was actually a turn off. So I wanted to create a multi-camera experience where it was more like a fusion between live television and theatre, so that it was using multiple cameras and live switching between the cameras, and it had really good sound quality. And so that's what I did with Black Box Live, and that continued for a couple of years until everything kind of recovered again, and I had a change in circumstance, and I put that to bed for a little bit. And then I've gone into bringing the internationals back, because during COVID we couldn't have internationals. So it's actually only been a couple of years since all of that happened. So that was a really big challenge, and I think it was a good opportunity for me to learn something new and diversify, and I won a couple of awards for doing it. I also strangely live streamed from South Australia into Edinburgh and Hollywood at the same time, which was intense and crazy, and we got shut down for the first week because there was a COVID scare in South Australia. But that was amazing because I participated in Hollywood and Edinburgh without leaving South Australia. And I was able to do that with a few other South Australian artists as well through Black Box Live. So that was really exciting. That was a big challenge. And now I know that that is a viable kind of platform. It's a bit of an expensive platform to run, but if we ever have the need for it, I know how to do it. And so that's really exciting.
That's that producer mind just coming out. You're like, here's a challenge, here's what a producer does.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, leave us with one last short story of your most interesting or awkward Fringe interaction, if you've got one of those fun little quippy stories for us.
Well, look, I've done a lot of Fringes, so it's actually quite difficult for me to kind of go, oh, well, there was this one time. But there was this one time, which kind of leads me to a bit of a moral of the story, I guess.
Great.
I've been networking, and a lot of people come up to me and they want to, talk to me about their show. And of course, I'm very open to listening to new work because I'm hungry for it. I want to hear what's happening out there in the world too. I want to meet new artists. And so really it's a very reciprocal kind of exchange, mostly. But this one time someone just kind of sat in front of me and said, so tell me about you. And I was like, oh, sorry? No, you're supposed to tell me about you. And they were like, oh no, well, I'm a insert show here or art form here. So what can you do for me? And I was like, I feel really awkward. I'm not supposed to be selling myself to you now. You sat in front of me. You should know who I am. Now, that sounds a little bit egotistical, but it's not. It's I don't know how I can help you until I know if I like your show, I like your work, if it's, if this is a good fit. This was several years ago, and it was really quite awkward. And I fed back that information to the organisers of the event, where, my name was up on the board and it had my bio and the way to kind of research who I was. And when you sat in front of me, you should have read that first. But the moral of this story is about time, because after 19 Fringes, I've realised you don't ever just do one Fringe. You don't just kind of come in it and go, I have arrived, look at what I'm doing, isn't it fabulous? Everyone melt at my feet. It has to be the long game. So whether this is your first Fringe or whether it's your 40th Fringe, you always have to invest in long-term relationships and play the softly touch with the industry and understand that this is an investment in a long-term future. So you're not just arriving and expecting people to kind of bend over backwards for what you're doing. You have to kind of play this long game of being human first. So that's kind of the moral of the story for this, for that little awkward interaction, is that instead of getting to know me as a human being and talking to me like I am a human being, it was the hard sell. So I hope that people listening to that remember that you can be a human first, and then we can talk about the work second.
I am more in love with you at the end of this interview than when we started. You are just saying all the things that make my heart flutter. Well, it has been so delightful to visit with you today, Joanne. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to little old American me. And
I loved it. I've loved it. It's been so great.
Good. Yeah.
And I hope that the listeners have got something out of this, and a little slice of Australia. and, a few words of wisdom and some fun stories.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you. Well, Joanne Hartstone Presents is presenting 14 shows at the Adelaide Fringe this year. You can grab those tickets to those incredible shows online at the Adelaide Fringe website. Make sure you go to the Joanne Hartstone Presents banner. Also put a link in the show descriptions for those. You can learn more about Joanne on her website at joannehartstone.com. And you can keep up with her and all of her productions on Instagram and Facebook at Joanne Hartstone Presents. What the Fringe is produced and hosted by me, Lauren Hantz. This episode was edited by Ben Ellis of Renowned Media. Those sweet tunes you hear are provided by Paul Snyder of Orchestra of Sound, and our logo was designed by Ruby Arnold of Ruby Makes Things. What the Fringe can be found on your favorite podcast platforms and now on YouTube at @WhatTheFringe_Productions. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the know when new episodes release. Keep up with What the Fringe on Instagram at @WhatTheFringe_Productions and visit our new website, WhatTheFringeProductions.com. When you're at the Fringe and people come up to you and they're asking you, hey, come see my show. And you're like, I am not seeing that show. And you have to come up with some stupid excuse as to why. You know who doesn't have to come up with a stupid excuse? Those artists who are at multiple productions. They're involved in so many, they literally don't have any time. They might be exhausted, but hey, they have the best excuse ever. And
maybe that's why 14 shows is actually a good thing.